Constitutional Studies at Utah Valley University. I want to thank Brian Birch, Lynn England, and many other folks here at the university that have put on this excellent conference and have brought us together for this wonderful panel. Joining with me today, and I should say our title of our panel, Bridging Divides in the Political Arena. So we'll be focusing particularly on politics, both here in Utah and abroad. So no great divisions that we have to worry about there, of course. Joining us today, to my right, we have Gary Herbert, former governor of Utah, who took office in 2009 as Utah's 17th governor. He was born and raised in Utah County, where he had eventually served as county commissioner for 14 years. He attended Brigham Young University, served 6 years in the Utah National Guard, and started a successful real estate brokerage and development company. Governor Herbert served as chair of the National Governors Association in 2015 and 2016. This past year, Utah Valley University was pleased to announce plans for the forthcoming Gary R. Herbert Public Policy Center as part of the university's new Gateway building. And the Herbert Institute does wonderful things on campus, and we're always happy to work with them. Next, we have Darlene McDonald, is a senior product support engineer at Oracle, author, social activist, and keyboard warrior. She also maintains and runs the Black Library, an online repository dedicated to literature written by African American and Black writers. Since 2017, she has served on the American Friends Service Committee Governance Corporation and is also on the Friends Relations Committee. She is chair of the Utah Black Roundtable and second vice chair of the Utah Democratic Black Caucus. She also serves as outreach director for the Women's Democratic Club and on the board of the CD4 Coalition. Next, we have Susan Pulsipher, is a Republican member of the Utah House of Representatives, representing District 45. She earned her Bachelor of Science in Elementary Education from Brigham Young University and her MED in Educational Leadership with an emphasis in policy, also from Brigham Young University. She served on the Board of Education for Jordan School District from 2011 to 2017, as Commissioner of the Northwest Association of Accredited Schools, and as Chair of the Oversight Panel for School Facilities. She has been recognized for exemplary civic leadership at CCSD and received Distinguished Service Awards from the NAAS. Last but certainly not least, on the further end there is Joe Briscoe, also a member of the Utah House of Representatives, representing District 24, the Democrat. He is a former school teacher and served as labor relations consultant before being his election to the Utah House in 2010. He serves as chair of the Douglas Neighborhood Association and East Central Community Council, and is a trustee of the Utah High School Activities Association. He is a former president of the Salt Lake City School Board and served on the executive committee of the National Council of Greater City Schools. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. A word or two by way of introduction, and I'm going to invite our panelists to take 7 or so minutes for an opening statement. I think we can all agree, despite our political and other differences, that our country is going through a time of deep division. Perhaps the most startling or striking example of this was pointed to in a poll by The Economist and YouGov last year that found that 43% of Americans think civil war in our country in the next 10 years is at least somewhat likely. Now, when I share this with my students, I point out that this isn't telling us the actual likelihood of such an event. It's pointing, though, to the way we feel about our current political moment. So at the very least, it tells us about the way we perceive our relations with each other, with the other side in our country today. Lest we think that perhaps we are immune to such political division, here in Utah, the Civic Thought Leadership Initiative recently ran a poll last year, again in the fall of 2022, that tried to explore what we call effective partisan polarization. That's a fancy political science term. The negative feelings we feel towards the other side of the political aisle, and the warm, friendly feelings we feel towards our own side. That survey was conducted by Dr. Jay Desart, chair of the political science department. He found that Utahns show a high level of effective partisan polarization, that we feel really good about our side. We feel very negative towards the other side. And that these level of feelings were on par or in the same realm as the effective partisan polarization that we see in the country as a whole. So at least at some level, this is a national question of deep political divisions, as well as a state one. And so I'm very grateful for our panelists who are joining us today, who do have clearly staked out positions in politics, and yet are willing to come together, have a conversation about what leads to this division and what maybe we can do about it. And so what I'd like to do is invite each of our panelists to reflect a little bit on our moment from their perspective. They come from different perspectives, different places in politics. Take a moment to reflect. And in preparation for that, I want to make one observation that I would love for us to be able to get to in our discussion today. And that's that some argue that what's causing our division today is the way in which we feel or treat others. In other words, it's the way we go about politics, not necessarily about politics itself. I think of Arthur Brooks, for example, that's talked about the contempt or disgust, deep disgust that partisans often have for those on the other side. So that's one approach. The other is the observation that Americans are deeply divided about real questions and issues in ways that get to some of our deepest commitments. In other words, we're divided on what justice means, what equality looks like, and even what it means to be human. If that's the case, then perhaps our approaches may be different. If it's a division, a deep division about real things versus a deep division about the way in which we go about discussing and engaging on those things. So with that in mind, we'll start with Governor Herbert and go down the line towards the right, not the political right, but to the right of the table. Don't worry, Representative Briscoe. And we'll go from there. After the 7-minute introductory remarks by each of our panelists, I'll then introduce some questions for the panelists, the nation, and also our state of Utah. And then at the end, we'll have time for your questions. So please be thinking, write down the thoughts, questions that you have for our panelists. Thank you.
Is it on? Go turn on. Okay, thank you. I'm honored to be here with all of you, and thanks for your attendance. It's great to be here with what an impressive panel that you have the opportunity to listen to and hear from, and I'm prepared to listen to and learn myself as I'm here today with all of you. So, bridging divides in the political arena. Sometimes we think that's kind of puzzling, particularly when you think about if you're Republican, Democrat, there's other parties, but the left or the right. And you say, don't we all have the same goals? We have the same desired outcomes, have prosperous people, have civil rights. We want to have people who live in peace and prosperity and live the American dream. Where we differ sometimes is on process. How do you get to that journey, journey's end? And we do differ on that aspect of it. But why do we have so much hard feelings about it, divisiveness? As I observe that, I observe that we always have had division in politics since our country's inception. And we could give a lot of examples of that, but John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, two of our wonderful founding fathers, didn't like each other. They were almost, they'd been friends, they became enemies, they felt like they were undermining their potential future political careers. And only later in life did they reconcile, as John Adams sent letters back and forth, and he sent 3 letters to Jefferson's 1. But they ended up kind of reconciling their differences, and interesting enough, died on the same day, July 4th. Why they had those differences is sometimes a little puzzling, but it was there. Our founding fathers had differences of opinion, yet found ways to come together and compromise and created the greatest man-made document in the history of the world, our Constitution. In 1856, we have a kind of a notorious event that took place with a fellow by the name of Brooks, who was a congressman, a representative, who did not like what Senator Sumner had been saying on the Senate floor about Kansas, and some of the people were supporting Kansas. The debate was whether it should be a free state or allowed to come in as a slave state. And he said some pretty vitriolic things about those sponsors, Senator Senator Sumner. And what happens is Representative Brooks, he walked over to the Senate floor, walked in, they were just adjourning. He walks over and took a cane with a metal thing on the end of it and started beating this guy over the head, knocked him unconscious. He couldn't get away from him. Nobody helped him. He calmly walked out of the Senate floor, and this guy's unconscious and bleeding. Took him weeks to recover. They censured the representative, and he resigned, only to run again at the next election and got reelected. In fact, both of them became heroes in their respective parties, and one guy about killed the other guy. Anyway, those things have happened throughout our history. The question probably for us today is, in spite of this, our most divisive time? And if so, why? I think it is more divisive. We certainly understand more of the division that's taking place, mainly because of media. And media has emerged in many different forms. The days of what some of the young people can't remember this, some of the old people, days of Walter Cronkite, that's the way it was. And he was trusted speaker for the news, reported it accurately, and people had trust. We don't find that today. The rise of cable TV, the demise of newspapers, the lack of substance, it's more quick, maybe not as substantive as it should have been. And consequently, we have media that's putting things in their air on television or radio, or even in their social media, to get clickbait, ratings up, have people, in fact, want to read and listen to their programs, only because they try to kind of sensationalize events and exaggerate sometimes what's taking place. So there is not the trust that we had once before in media, but everybody is permeated by some different points of view. And as Republicans, they go to Fox News, Democrats go to MSNBC, and those siloed efforts kind of reinforce our own preconceived notions, whether they're right or wrong. And consequently, we have this significant divisiveness in our country today. I'm sure we'll talk about what we're doing differently in Utah. I think we have been able to handle things better. We don't have quite the divisiveness in Utah that we see. But politics has become what people now refer to as a blood sport. It's personalized, it's nasty, it's mean, and no regard. I mean, it's viewed, the opponent is us versus them, and them is always the enemy. So it's a difficult time and a difficult challenge, and hopefully we can resolve some of those issues today and maybe put us on a better step forward, how we can get along with more mutual respect and trying to find solutions to problems together as opposed to divisiveness, which usually ends up as being stalemated and nothing gets done. Honored to be here with you.
Thank you. And just a reminder to our panelists, these mics are a little bit finicky. You kind of have to get up and close. Appreciate it.
How is that? Okay, excellent. So, for those who don't know who I am, my name is Darlene McDonald. I am the National Committee Woman for the DNC to represent Utah. And I really have to get you a new bio because that one was so old.
My apologies, thank
That's
you.
okay. That's okay, quite all right. A lot of it was correct, but a lot of it no longer applies, but we'll talk about that later. But what brings me here this morning is the conversation for bridging the political divide. And I have to say, first and foremost, it is an honor to be here with you, and it's an honor to share this table with our distinguished guests as well. I say that there are 3 stages of political engagement. And those 3 stages are: you are a voter. You turn 18, and you pretty much do what your parents did or your community has done, and you vote. Don't really think too much about it. People around you say, hey, are you going to vote? You register, you vote. That's stage 1. Stage 2, I call activism. And that is when something moves you and you want to speak to the issue. You may show up and testify for public hearings. You may go to rallies. So you advance from the voter stage to maybe an activist level. The 3rd stage is what I would call the policymakers, like the people here on this table. I would say stage, but it's a table. And that's when you can actually shape, inform, and determine and write policy that will change people's lives. For me, I started, like most people, just pretty much a voter and stayed that way for most of my life. Got married, became a single mom, became a working single mom, and pretty much all I had time to do was to just be a voter. And then the issue of healthcare happened. My children were older at that time, and we had passed, the Obama administration had passed the Affordable Care Act. And after the Obama administration, there became a time when the Affordable Care Act was going to be repealed. That shook me. And that shook me from being just a voter to an activist. And I became an activist for healthcare. And the reason why I became an activist for healthcare is because I had the experience of having a child that was born with a lot of health problems, and he passed away when he was 3 years old. But I knew what it was like to be a parent with a child that needed special medical attention, health care. He had Medicaid, and if it was not for Medicaid, we would not have had the 3 years with him. He would not have had the smile that he had, and I would not have had the wonderful memories of that smile of him had it not been for the services that we received under Medicaid. So with the threat to Medicaid and the people who didn't know that they were going to be me one day, because I didn't know when I was 22 years old and pregnant that I was going to have a child that was going to be born with tremendous health issues. So that moved me to become an activist. And then I moved to the next stage of trying to be a policymaker, or at least influence the policies that impacts our lives, is because of the question that we all ask ourselves. And I'm sure every member on this panel have asked themselves one day, is how do you become the change that you want to see? So sometimes if you don't see the things happening around you and the people, the legislators who represent you are not speaking to the issues that are important to you, then you say, how do I be the change that I want to see. So that moved me to that third stage. I am a descendant of African American parents who were part of the Great Migration from Alabama to Ohio in the 1950s. They moved to Ohio to escape the Jim Crow laws of the South during the 1950s before the Civil Rights Act was passed of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So for me, it was a natural fit to transition through those stages. I was raised in a Pentecostal evangelical faith. My father's a Pentecostal minister, or still is a Pentecostal minister. And like most evangelical African American churches, they were, and I was raised, socially liberal. No, I take that back. Socially conservative and political liberal. So I pretty much voted the same way my parents did. And it wasn't until I was about 18, 19 years old when I started to really think about the policies that I was voting for. And then along the way, I didn't always vote the same way they did. I actually didn't vote for all Democrats. I actually voted for, yes, I voted for Ross Perot. Yes, I was one of those. But I also voted for Huntsman, Governor Huntsman, when I moved here to Utah, because I believed in the man, in what he represented. So it wasn't just about political ideology for me. I really appreciate what Governor Herbert said when he mentioned the impact of media on our politics, and especially tribalism within our politics. I already mentioned the ACA, so I'm going to mention it again. There was a survey or questions and interviews with people who were against the ACA. And the interviewer asked several people, how do you feel about your children staying on your healthcare policy until they're 26 years old? Everyone loved it. How do you feel about insurance companies not being able to deny you for pre-existing conditions any longer? How do you feel about that? Great. Everyone loved it. How do you feel about, for women? Because before, women were considered a pre-existing condition. You're a woman, you would charge more for health care. So how do you feel about getting rid of that? No, health insurance companies can no longer charge women a higher premium than men. Everyone loved it. How do you feel about Obamacare? Hate it. Absolutely hate it. It is destroying the country. Every single one of these policy issues was Obamacare. Is Obamacare. How do you feel about the ACA? Love it. We need the ACA, get rid of Obamacare. Obamacare is the ACA. These are true stories. I'm not making it up. And it is shaped by the media that we consume and how we're going to feel about policies. I appreciate what he said when he said that we probably don't disagree very much on the issues. We probably don't. I'm one of those people who believe that government needs to stay the heck out of my business. I really don't believe in too much government. You shouldn't be in my bedroom and you shouldn't be in my body. I believe that. You shouldn't care what faith I am. You shouldn't care who I marry, who I love. None of your business. It's none of the government's business. That's between me, my family, my God. I believe that. So we probably are aligned on that. But at the same time, I had a conversation with a former representative here in Utah who didn't win her re-election. But as she campaigned, and this actually broke my heart because I actually think she's an incredible woman, an absolutely incredible woman. I like her a lot. Other than, we are on the same political aisle. She is a wonderful woman, beautiful too, inside and out. And as she was campaigning, one of her neighbors said that they were going to pray for her, which is great, wonderful. Bring it on, pray for me as much as you want to. But they were going to pray for her because she was a Democrat. Not because there was something that she was ailing, her back was hurting or anything like that. They actually agreed on the issue. He was going to pray for her because she was a Democrat. And that broke my heart. She really, truly is a wonderful person. And I think this gentleman believed that she was a wonderful person and would be saved if she just wasn't a Democrat. Most of us are part of our political party for a reason. For me, I actually believe in the policies. I believe in things like the ACA, that people should have health insurance and people shouldn't go bankrupt because they don't have health insurance. That's something I believe in. And how we get back to our politics where we can see each other. See each other. And you're right, the caning of Charles Sumner. Oh, I write about that a lot, actually. Preston Brooks was re-elected after he caned Charles Sumner. He was re-elected. He didn't serve again because he died. But he was re-elected. That means people were okay with him caning a sitting U.S. senator over the issue of slavery. You have the Missouri Compromise, you have the Kansas City, the Kansas Act, Nebraska Kansas Act. That's a whole other conversation. You can see me afterwards if you want to talk about that. But it was over the expansion of slavery. The Nebraska Kansas Act ruled that the Missouri Compromise is illegal. It was unconstitutional. So yeah, that's what happened there. But he was reelected. So we as voters have to pay attention, have to be mindful of the people we are electing and why. Why would the voters re-elect a man who caned a sitting senator on a Senate floor? That's on us. That's on us. Right now we have Senator Mitt Romney, who I think is okay. There's some things I'm like, hey, Mitt, I don't know, I have problems with. But for the most part, he tries. He tries. But the Emory County, right now, Republican Party are going to vote to censure him because he was, they feel, aiding and abetting Democrats, I think that's what it was, something like that. Providing comfort, that's it, providing comfort to Democrats, so they're going to censure him. So this is on us. We have to demand better. We have to say that in order to bridge that divide, we have to accept the responsibility of expecting more from our legislators and when it comes to how we come together and be able to work with those on the other side and look at the issues that bring us together rather than the person, maybe. But I'm going to end there, and I do this all the time, and I know she's gonna hate me, but I would like to acknowledge that Gail Blattenberger just came in. And for those who are not familiar with Gail, Gail is a leader here in Utah. She was part of the civil rights movement, and I acknowledge her every time she walks in the door. Because if it was not for the work of Gail Blattenberger, many people who look like me wouldn't be here. And so Gail came in, and my heart is full to see her come in. And she was a part of the students that went from the north to the south to tutor African Americans in math in St. Augustine, Florida. And the place that she was tutoring African Americans was firebombed by the KKK. And she survived because the propane tank was empty. So every time she comes in, I acknowledge her, because I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for people like her. Thank you.
Good morning. Does that work? Okay, awesome. It's so good to be with you. This is such an important discussion and such an important conversation. I've had the opportunity to think about some of my experiences, and as I've been preparing for this, and I agree with much of what's said. We've always had differences of opinion, and sometimes very stark, as was referenced at the beginning of our country. And I think that's good. I think it's important. It's not that we have differences, it's what we do about it. I think that makes the biggest difference in how we let that work. I had an interesting experience when I got my master's degree in educational leadership with an emphasis in policy. And I think the emphasis in policy, you know, in many of my classes, we talked about issues of policy. And prior to getting that master's degree, I'm quite conservative in my ideology, and I would think about issues, and I would think about what my position was and what my thoughts were. And anyone who disagreed with me, I thought, well, they're just unenlightened. And they just, you know, you kind of get a little bit of the bad people thought when you think about that. And as I sat in those classes and I listened to different issues and different thoughts, I found something very different and interesting happening to me. I started listening to them and saying, oh, that's an interesting thought. And I rarely changed my ultimate outcome of my position, but I had a much different thought about the other side. I respected their thought. And I found myself saying quite often, oh, if I had thought the way they did, they have some really good points. And I can see why they think the way they do. And it's not because they're a bad person. It's because they have some really good information and good thoughts. It changed me. It really was fascinating. When I finished, in fact, my master's program, thinking about what I'd learned, and I, at that time, also, I was not in politics at all, nor did I ever intend to be. And so things have changed there. But I thought, I think the most important thing that I learned from that master's program, and I thought this at the time, is how to listen to different points of view and be respectful of them and understand them. And it was good. It was so good. And I also found that not only did I understand their viewpoint better than I ever had, and actually had, wow, I can see how you'd feel that way. And you have some good points. But I also found that I understood my own viewpoint better. Because I could say, oh, well, I really still think this way about this issue, but because of this and this and this reason. And I understood myself better. And it was good. And I think that is something that is missing in today's differences of opinion, because I think we should have differences of opinion. But I think sometimes what's missing is that understanding and that listening ear. Also, another thing I wanted to point out, because I've been in the House of Representatives, this was my 7th session, much less than Joe, but I think he'll agree with me. When I first got elected, my husband said, you guys go up there and you just vote party lines. And so one day he came and sat with me, and I said, actually, that's not the case. And he sat with me, and he said, oh my gosh, you're right. That we really vote not party lines more than we vote party lines. You know, I mean, there's a lot of issues that we just agree on. But the other thing that I thought was really interesting is, especially, we used to have a colleague who was very libertarian, you know, very right in libertarian, and he actually voted with the Democrats sometimes for different reasons. But the end vote was the same, you know, and that was so interesting. And speaking of that, whenever we had a big issue, I love to have him stand and make comments, because I wanted to hear what he thought about it. Because again, he was like really, you know, he was a libertarian, very, very to the right. And I find that the best solutions come when we listen to each other and when we think about it. One of the things in my experience, when I was on Jordan's school board, people would come, sometimes people would call me and they would say, we've got this situation in my neighborhood or my school or whatever, and they were upset about it and they wanted something to happen about it. And I'd listen to them, and quite frequently I'd say, you're right. This is a situation that probably needs to be addressed. And say, you need to talk to the school board about this. But let me help you. And so I would say, when you go, you know, bring a number of people, that's good, but don't all of you talk, just a couple, don't repeat yourselves. I'd kind of coach him. And I knew that what they were needed to do and would be trying to do would be to influence a decision and to be persuasive. So I'd say, you know, be persuasive. And then I actually did say this. I said, use your nice words. Because I knew as soon as they started yelling and using not nice words, that my colleagues on the school board would turn their ears off and wouldn't listen. And I know sometimes we think we need to yell louder and say it meaner so we can make something happen. So I tell them not to do that. But I kind of, again, coach them through this. And, you know, it was so interesting because pretty much every single time they did what I told them to do, their issue got addressed. And usually the way they, you know, they were happy about. And that taught me something. These are just lessons that I've learned, you know, in my career of how to have differences of opinion, but still make that difference of opinion, make us come to better solutions rather than just being angry, which we see too much in today's world. And I agree with the media issue too. In fact, a couple of days ago, I got an email from a constituent, and she said she had seen something in the media, and actually I'd seen it too, so I knew what she was talking about, and she said, oh, please make sure this doesn't happen, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And I wrote back to her and I said, you know, what they're talking about was true in Utah about 5 years ago. But actually this year we passed this bill and this bill and this bill that actually is going the other direction because things have changed. And she said, oh, I'm so sorry, I just had no idea. So it gets tricky on the media sometimes because it's hard to get accurate information. But I think the important thing is coming to good decisions. I'm so grateful that our founding fathers found their way through their differences of opinions to actually come to put together what I consider is, you know, this amazing government, amazing constitution, amazing government. I'm so grateful they were able to do that, and I believe that we can do that today.
Thank you.
I spent 33 years in public education, 2/3 of them teaching at Bountiful High School, where I taught U.S. history, U.S. government, AP, U.S. government, AP comparative government. So you'll understand where I'm going next. A shout out to Governor Herbert to giving us a piece of history, and I'm going to finish that out for you. The Massachusetts senator who was beaten into a bloody pool on the floor of the U.S. Senate. His egregious error was in a fiery speech on the floor of the Senate. He said, that slavery, that harlot slavery. Preston Brooks was from South Carolina. He broke his cane. He said, I can only imagine what this would have looked like had they had Twitter and Instagram and Snapchat at the time, but they did this and the internet at the time, which was magazines and newspapers. He said, my only regret is that I broke my cane. Hundreds of people melted into canes. The senator from Massachusetts went to Europe to recuperate. He was a Republican, because at that time, Republicans were the anti-slavery party. He went to Europe to recuperate. The Republican Party refused to nominate a new person to take his place. He was reelected overwhelmingly in Massachusetts, even though he had not been in Congress for months. 20 years earlier, you could have a debate in Virginia about whether to get rid of slavery in the 1810s and the 1820s. But by 1840, you could not have a debate in Virginia about whether or not to get rid of slavery. And we became two camps. And one of the reasons South Carolina kicked off the secession movement was that Abraham Lincoln, there were four people got electoral college votes in the election of 1860. Abraham Lincoln got a majority without winning one southern state, and the southern states said, we're done. We're absolutely over. They can do anything they want to slavery, and we can't stop them. Why should we stay? There were courageous voices in the South arguing against secession. And Obamacare, that awful thing that the citizens in Utah signed a petition and voted to expand in Utah, was developed by the Heartland Institute, which is a right-wing think tank. And it's okay if it comes from a right-wing think tank, but it's not okay if a Democratic president does it. Just saying. One of the things that happens in legislation, let me go to John Stuart Mill. I'm a devotee of John Stuart Mill, that enlightened Englishman who wrote essays in the 1800s in England, like why women should have the right to vote, etc. He said, he who knows only his side of the story knows little of that. And he goes on to say, you really need to hear both sides of the story, and you shouldn't hear the other side of the story from the person who's advocating for something different. You really need to hear it from the people who were the most eloquent advocates for that side, whether you agree or not. That's who you need to hear it from. I mean, as a debate coach, I had to do this, right? Because you're going to walk into a round and you're going to flip a coin, and you could be affirmative or you could be negative. So you better have an affirmative plan and you better have a negative plan. The other thing that, I just finished my 13th legislative session. And one of the things that happens every 2 years, we get a slew of how many new Republicans this year? 17, 15? We get a whole bunch of new Republicans every year. Occasionally we get a new Democrat too. And what will happen in some fashion or other after 2 weeks is some Democrat will be grabbed by a Republican and go, Briscoe, come here. Don't tell anyone, but I really like you Democrats. And then they run off. Because when they come up there, we live in bubbles, right? We live in bubbles. And the internet was 20 years ago, the internet was gonna make us free. Now we know it's enslaved us. The internet has put us in digital tribes where we reinforce constantly our confirmation bias. I'm gonna tell you a story you're not gonna hear very often in Utah County. My mother's turned 88 last month. If she were here, I'd say she slipped. She's had a couple of falls in the last 2 months. We've been spending a lot of time with her. One of my heroes is her doctor, who told her 6 months ago, stop driving the car. Didn't compromise, and she listened to him, and we didn't have to fight with her. 3 years ago, she tells us, my sister calls me and said, you need to hear this, Joel. She goes to her hearing aid doctor, and she starts railing on Donald Trump, and the room is very quiet. So I visited her the next week. I go, Mom, you need to understand something. You live in a blue bubble. All you watch is CNN. All you watch is MSNBC. You talk to your kids. Bountiful voted for Trump, Mom. She said, they did. I said, Mom, they're Republican. She said, why would they vote for Trump? I said, it's a long story. But look, you can share your political views with anyone you want to, but you live in a blue bubble, Mom. And if you go outside your house and talk to people where you live, they're not going to see things the same way. She lives in her little bubble. So Republicans come up and they listen to Republican social media and they listen to conservative viewpoints, and then they come and they talk to Democrats, and my gosh, they kind of like some of the Democrats. And it's difficult for my constituents to understand how closely I work with Representative Susan Pulsipher, who's the co-chair of the Public Ed Appropriations Committee that I have sat on for 12 years, 11 years, that she does a good job. She's effective and she's fair, and I appreciate her. So I sponsored a piece of legislation this year I got passed called HB 21, deals with Open and Public Meetings Act. Last summer, in the interim, I'm sitting on a committee. Representative Brammer from County comes up. He sponsored the bill last year, got it through the House unanimously. It didn't go anywhere this time. The Open Public Meetings Act is, most every state has one. In Utah, if you're a public agency, a public body, you have to publish an agenda 24 hours in advance. You have to send it out to news media. And lately, we say you need to put it online so that people know what's on the agenda, right? The attorneys, the legislature told me it's not the greatest written section of the code, because every 3 or 4 years, someone opens it up to fix something, and you fix something over here and here and here, but no one takes the whole thing and says, does it all make sense and do all the words matter? I found a piece in there that says the purpose of government is to help people, is to do this and set policy and listen to comments from, the people of Utah. But nowhere does it say specifically that people should have a chance to speak and say their mind. The Constitution, the First Amendment of the United States says that Congress shall not make any laws restricting the ability of the people peaceably to assemble and petition the government for redress of grievances. They were wordsmiths, and they were very parse in their use of language. The Constitution is not very long. They put the word peaceably in on purpose. We have forgotten that. We forgot it in the 10, 15 years leading up to the Civil War. We forgot it in the 1960s over the Vietnam War, when people were blowing up buildings and burning ROTC buildings. And we've forgotten in the last several years that the Constitution says we will peaceably assemble and tell the government thing. So some of my closest allies in this legislation, the House of Representatives, are some of the anti-maskers. Okay, the people who were angry at school boards because some school boards were shutting down debate. I didn't agree with them because they were anti-maskers. I agreed with them because we shared a value. And this is the value we shared. I believe if you're an elected official, you need to put on your big boy or your big girl pants, and you need to hear some stuff you don't want to hear sometimes. That we have a responsibility to the people we represent to allow them to come and criticize us. I think we have a responsibility to do that. I think the people who come to complain to us have a responsibility to provide alternatives. And they can't always give you an alternative. Sometimes the best they can do is tell you how they think your policies are harming them. They have the right to come and tell you they don't like your tax policy, that whatever you're doing in the city, if you're changing the zoning is going to damage their neighborhood, that your policies for the school are not going to help their kids. They have the right to come and say that. They have a responsibility not to threaten a public official. They have a responsibility not to make public officials' lives hell. They have a responsibility not to go to the Granite School Board meeting, declare themselves sovereign citizens, and chase the school board out of their own building. In my district, they have a responsibility not to go to the Inland Port meetings and pour dirt on the table and chase them out of their room. You have a responsibility to allow elected officials to do their thing. And elected officials have a responsibility to listen, in my opinion. So, was I willing to work with people that I disagreed with on school policy? Absolutely was I willing to work with them, because I felt this value was so important. And I felt like I could stand up and say, I believe in this value, and I think we should say so as a state legislature. I don't have time, take me to lunch or breakfast, and I'll tell, it's kind of a fun story. I'm being attacked by a guy in Cache County who is a serial grandma requester, and he thinks we're doing something dangerous and is suspicious that there were 5 substitutes. And I can tell you that every one of the substitutes is kind of fun. What passed the legislature says school boards have to allow open public meetings. I'm going to file in May a new bill, and I'm going to add cities and counties to it next year. I couldn't get that through the legislature this year. I had 2 county commissioners from southern Utah come and ask me to exempt 5th and 6th class counties from the bill because they don't want to listen to out-of-state environmentalists come and complain to them 12 months in a row about their environmental policies. I went and checked their agendas, and every one of their agendas they have open comment for the public. But they were asking me to take it away. I had school boards email me, "What's up with this, Briscoe?" I said, "Listen, here's the deal. If you are appropriating money, if you are spending citizens' tax dollars, if you are obligating them to a bond, if you are changing policy, I think you should hear from the public at that meeting." We've exempted work meetings where all they do is give reports. In some instances, we've exempted some versions of planning commission meetings. I think this speaks to the moment we're in which we're at a point in which we say we don't want to listen. We don't want to listen to people who disagree with us. I'll give you a homework assignment. Find anything you can read by Jonathan Haidt, H-A-I-D-T, teaches New York Stern School of Business. He published 1 year, 11 months ago in Atlantic Magazine. Here's the title of the article: "Why the Past 10 Years of American Life Have Been Uniquely Stupid." Okay, it's a provocative title. The article is not quite like that as it sounds. He takes on conservatives and progressives. I like him because he doesn't sit in one camp and just shoot at the other side. He says there's 3 things we need to do to save democracy. We need to harden democratic institutions so they're more difficult to take down. We need to reform social media. Part of the reason we're having these debates is because people are getting paid to make us angry and to drive us into camps. And we need to prepare the next generation. I mean, I taught high school. I'm deeply committed. 35 and under, you are the biggest voting bloc in Utah, in the United States of America, 35 and under. My son didn't vote in 2016 because he didn't like Hillary Clinton and he didn't like Donald Trump. I begged him to vote. He had a son. He lives in Oregon. You're electing the next governor. You were represented by the Speaker of the House. Vote. Write in. Skip the president rights. Just vote. You want to change Utah under 35s? Pick your issues. I know most of you don't believe in political parties. Most people under 40 in America don't believe they're Republicans or Democrats. We don't get that because we were raised differently. Okay? But voting is the way you change things. Ultimately, pick your candidates, pick your issues. You can take over Utah, and you can take over the United States of America if you want to. Right now, you're sitting, a lot of you are sitting and critiquing it, but you're not getting in the game. Thank you.
Well, thank you to our panelists for those opening remarks. I want to begin. This is something that each of you touched on in your remarks, but perhaps if we could just in a sentence or two or a focused take. What is the root of our deep divisions? Is it about the way we go about politics? I think we've heard dimensions of that from each of you. Or is it deep division about particular issues themselves? Because I think each of you touched on that to some degree as well, right? There are some issues, things like the division between pro-life, pro-choice, the division between what justice requires, is it affirmative action or colorblind action on behalf of government? I mean, all these things are deeply held views about what fairness is, etc., right? And so my question for you is, which is it? Is it the way we go about it? Is it issues themselves? Or is it some combination? Maybe Representative Briscoe, if we could start with you, and we'll go this direction.
You know, when we get to, I have a neighbor next door to me who sends me every other month, who sends me a Marjorie Taylor Greene YouTube. And I was very concerned for her. I prayed for her in December when I got a message. I prayed for her. She's my neighbor and I love her. I don't know why you're laughing. So she can have completely different opinions than me and I can't care for it. Why do we laugh at, why are you laughing at me? I'm kind of dismayed. She sent me an email in December which indicated to me that she bought off on QAnon. She said it doesn't matter, but she said it's all up to God anyway. It's now good versus evil. It broke my heart to think that she was there. I don't argue with her. My wife argues with her on Twitter. I don't argue with her. I don't want to get into those fights with her. It's not going to change anything. That's where she's at. No one's going to come and change me by saying I have facts that you don't understand. We have to know each other. I know a lot of the parts of a lot of the Republicans. I don't agree with a lot of their policies. Some of them I do, some of them I don't. But I know them. That's why I have great hope, because what UVU is doing this. Okay? Because UVU is doing this, and they're making this dialogue happen, and we need more of it. And there are people who are making money off dividing us. And the Russians figured that out, and they're screwing with our election. I can't use the term they use, but it's going to flood the zone with SHIT and throw so much at people that they confuse us and they take us off our game. We need to know what our game is. If you weren't here to hear what Clayton said earlier, you need to go listen to that. We need to know each other. We agree more than we disagree, but there are people who it's advantageous for them to split us and divide us and not find solutions.
Thank you.
I apologize. I've had that happen in the past, and that's easy for us to do, is to laugh. We should not be laughing. We should not be making fun and diminishing people who disagree vehemently with us, because one thing we do is we say, you're not like me and you're not human. That's what allows a lot of the terrors that take place. We can hack people to death in Eastern Africa because your tribe's not human and my tribe is.
So my opinion is, I think we do have some very strong and divisions on policy, but I think that's good. I don't think it's bad. And I think as we've heard, we've always had strong divisions on policy, whether it was, in the war, in, World War II, or the Civil War, the founding of our country. And I think it's what we do that is really important. I also love the book, Love Your Enemies by Arthur Brooks. And I love what he said. The key is not bland agreement, but rather a culture of warm-heartedness toward our political foes, a vigorous but respectful competition of ideas. And I think it is in having effective debate, not mean-spirited, but effective debate, where we can actually come to agreement that, or figure out what to do that might be an answer we haven't even thought of. But as we work together, we can, and I've had that opportunity and seen that happen in the legislature, where I worked with some people on the left on some child care policies, and we came to some really good solutions as we worked together and listened, even though we started at very different places. So I think it's what we do, not the fact that we can't do anything about our divisions.
Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. As a student of history, I have to say, there's a saying that if you know your history and learn your history, it'll prevent you from making the mistakes of your past. I paraphrase that quite a bit. Diversity of opinion is good. That's how we get really good policies. When two people can come together on different sides of the aisle and hash out their differences to get to that compromise that everyone is happy, okay with. Maybe not totally happy, but okay with. We can usually come up with some pretty good policy. The problem is, to the question, root of division, of the 4 people that are here, I'm not actually at the legislature. I never served on the legislature or in the legislature. But what we see on the outside, what we see as the impact of social media, in our media, MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, doesn't matter. But if we have politicians who will go behind doors and have great relationships with each other but bash each other on television, that contributes to the division. Because constituents believe that that's what it is. That's politics. That's no longer having the wherewithal to even be able to compromise, to primary someone if they do compromise with the other side. And then you end up with very tribal people, political parties, who will punish their representatives for agreeing, if you're a Democrat, a Republican, if you're a Republican, a Democrat. So if those conversations are happening behind closed doors, maybe we need to see them out front. Maybe we need to see how it actually works without the politicians being afraid of being primaried for agreeing with a Democrat or Republican. I don't want to hear that.
Robert, clearly 1 hour is not enough time for this subject. I appreciate the comments that have been made, and just briefly, some things that's gone through my mind is one of my favorite shows was a movie called Cool Hand Luke. Some of you remember that. And the warden used to say often in the movie, what we have here is a failure to communicate. And that's certainly true in politics. We have a failure to communicate. I think we saw a little of that right here just a minute ago. And I think an adage that my wife taught me is that one, communication is the toughest thing in life. Husbands and wives, parents to children, politicians to constituents, teachers to students. I mean, it is hard to communicate accurately. And we're in a society now that people seem to take offense very quickly. And so my wife taught me, look, got to be very careful, slow to give offense. Sometimes we need to be direct and say it like it is. I get that. We're going to try to make sure we deliver with respect and not give offense. Just as important, though, equally as we ought to be slow to take offense. We see in society today, my gosh, if somebody looks at you just a little bit crooked, they're offended and take offense when no offense was meant. So we ought to learn how to communicate better. I can tell you that there's a lot of issues out there that are complicated and complex, and there's some evolution. But the question of whether we have differences of policy or differences of process, I'll give you one that we've had major differences for a long time, and now it's still having a major impact on society, and that's abortion. You know, that's a major difference. People are pro-life, pro-choice, and how they line up is a big emotional problem for a lot of people on both sides of the issue. We ought to understand that and respect it. But the process also, for many on the pro-life side, is that why is it made, we've kind of alluded to this, by 9 people in black robes as opposed to the legislature who ought to be making policy? That's a difference in process, not just a substantive difference in the idea of abortion. So it's both things for sure. I think that we have evolution of policy. You know, people, Ron was mentioned, and he certainly has evolved as he's learned more. I sat with him, I know. I think he's trying to do the level best he can, but gets punished because people want him to vote his conscience. If you said, what do we want people to do when they get elected? We want to be honest, transparent, listen to the constituents, and vote their conscience. And somebody does that, we will punish them on both sides of the aisle. We want you to vote your conscience as long as it agrees with me and our party platform. And that, unfortunately, is a problem. As governor, one of the smartest things I did was I met with the Democrats as a Republican governor once a week. And we would say, what's on your mind? What are the issues you want to talk about? Maybe we can come together with common ground, and I can help you as governor. There with Republicans, too. And as mentioned by Joel, I think, you know, about 80% of our bills that we pass in the Utah legislature are bipartisan, virtually voted by unanimously on both sides of the aisle. It's only a few that make the headlines where we have some real difficulties. Tim Shriver, who some of you may know who Tim is. If you don't, you know his sister, Maria Shriver, who was married to Arnold Schwarzenegger, a moderate Republican governor of California. And Tim said, why can't we get along? I long for the days when we had Ronald Reagan sit down with Tip O'Neill and say, what can we do together? And together they ended up having the greatest tax cut in American history, led to the greatest peacetime prosperity in American history, Democrats and Republicans working together. Now, he said, I long for the days when your Orrin Hatch would sit down with my Uncle Ted Kennedy and work out some issues, what they can work together on and get some things done, as opposed to the devices now where everybody's stalemate. And I think that's, again, I agree with Tim that we ought to be doing better to get things done. I'll just mention a couple things in conclusion. Immigration has been a very emotional issue for people. When I first came into governor, we had people being booed at their conventions on both sides of the aisle for being too pro-immigration or anti-immigration. Run them up, ship them home. That issue's been around since 1980 with Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, for heaven's sake. You remember Ronald Reagan? That's how old it's been, long ago, and yet today we're no closer to solving the immigration problem we were back in the 1980s when Reagan gave an amnesty to the 7,000 or 8,000, 100,000 people who are here in the country. Both parties are using it as a political tool to weaponize it, Democrats and Republicans. And yet, most common sense people can sit down and solve it in a week. Let's do this, let's do that. I met with President Obama about immigration. We wanted to do a state approach to help bring people out of the shadows, have them pay taxes, but not persecute them. We were taken to court and we lost in court, with the court saying that's a federal issue, states stay out of it. President Obama tried to do it by executive order. He got sued and didn't get it done either. And then I was talking with him, he says that's because the Congress is not doing their duty to make policy. And the problem is not the wall, or the fence, the problem is the gate. People can't, I was raised with migrant farm workers right here in this area of Utah. They'd come and work in the orchards, work on the farms, then go back home, south of the border, wherever they came from. They don't do that now because they don't think they can get back in. Immigration is a policy that can be resolved if people just had a desire, a willingness to create good policy, as opposed to win the political battle, particularly that's functions of re-election. Last but not least, you know, a lot of this stuff is tied to money. And as we as a country approach $31.5 trillion in debt, it's easy to say we need this program or that program. One thing I never saw as governor, and Joel and Susan probably agreed in their tenure there, nobody's ever come back to the legislature, nobody's ever come back to Congress and said, you know, you gave us too much money last year. Can we give some of it back? They come back and say, we need more, we need more, we need more. And there's not really any attempt to be more efficient. Does anybody believe Washington, D.C. is 100% efficient with how they spend the money? We actually cut the budget in the state of Utah, cut the amount of money we spent, not just reduce the increase, called it a cut. That's Washington speak. But if we're entitlements, gosh, don't get me started. It's a Ponzi scheme. Eventually, we're going to have to pay the piper. They're not sustainable. We've got to get Republicans and Democrats to come together and see what do we need to do to reform Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. How can we afford it? More tax revenues? We're going to have to raise taxes. We're going to cut spending. How are we going to do that? You think reasonable people can come together, come up to compromise, and actually spend money responsibly that they're taking from the taxpayer? We are doing it in Utah. If we do it in Utah, they can do it in Washington, D.C. Utah is the gold standard. Last comment, and I'll tell you why. The U.S. United States Chamber of Commerce did an analysis of the 50 states, the 5 territories, and came back and said the best place for government and business is Utah. And they said, and I know it was true because on the front page of the Deseret News, they said the reason that Utah is doing so well is because the spirit of cooperation and collaboration is in greater abundance in the state of Utah than any state in America. That really is the secret sauce. We call it the Utah way. And more states ought to have the Utah way, be fiscally prudent, and make sure that we're doing what we can do as a government and let the rest be to the private sector. We'd all get along a heck of a lot better and be more efficient on the outcomes, something we can actually afford to do. So, great discussion. I wish we had another hour.
Thank you. Are we time? Okay. Well, obviously we did need more time because we weren't able to get to your questions. And so I hope that if you had questions that have been prompted from this discussion today, hopefully our panelists have a few minutes afterwards. You're welcome to come up and ask them those questions.
You know,
Please.
you're going to have us back because I have several answers to what you
Excellent. I hear round 2 as a possibility. Brian's giving us the thumbs up. Please welcome me in thanking our panelists for their time today.